Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Tracy Newman, and I am a pediatrician and the medical director here at the North Dakota State University Center for Immunization Research and Education. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Jessica Steyer, who will be presenting this webinar titled "The Evidence Hasn't Changed: Communicating Vaccine Science When the Landscape Has." Dr. Steyer, founder and CEO of Unbiased Science, is an accomplished public health expert and a respected independent voice on health science. Her 2025 guest essay in the New York Times, "The Playbook Used to Prove Vaccines Cause Autism," tackled one of the most damaging myths in public health, that vaccines cause autism. Dr. Steyer is dedicated to rigorous scientific inquiry and bettering the health and welfare of communities. Her work has also been featured in The Lancet, Salon, NBC, Forbes, Nature, Argo Food, and Medium, and she writes prolifically on Substack. Dr. Steyer, welcome. You can begin.
Thanks so much, Dr. Newman, and thank you all for having me. I'm super excited to be here. And just to be transparent, I was letting folks know right before we began that unfortunately, Flu B has hit my household hard, which feels very on brand for 2026 and for the topic at hand here. So apologies if I have to take a break to take a sip of water or cough, and my two young kids are also home with the flu. I am going to turn my camera off in just one moment, but I wanted to just reiterate that I am a public health scientist. My background in training is actually in evaluation science, so using data to evaluate programs and policies. And then early in the pandemic, I just fell into science communication and have completely fallen in love with it. It has become my life's passion and now my work at Unbiased Science. And what we do is we communicate science on a variety of different topics, but primarily on vaccines and preventable illness and infectious disease. And we do so, as I'll explain throughout this presentation, using infographics on social media. We have a podcast, video content, and long form content. And we currently reach an audience of between 10 to 30 million people per month, which is just bananas because I always make the joke that I thought it would just be my mom and her friends following along. But through this journey of science communication for the past 6 years, I've learned a lot about what works and what doesn't work. So I'm going to share that with you today. I'm going to go ahead and turn off my camera now. All righty, let's get to it. Here are my disclosures. All right, so a few different objectives for today. First, we're going to talk about the current state of vaccine safety evidence. So, what the research does and does not show regarding commonly cited concerns. We're going to talk about how recent policy and institutional changes affect where and how healthcare, public health professionals, and also the public access reliable vaccine information. And finally, we're going to talk about some evidence-based communication strategies to address vaccine falsehoods and misinformation, and how to build trust in clinical and public health settings. So I think it goes without saying that right now we're really in uncharted territory. Now, interestingly, I say that the science on vaccine safety and efficacy has not changed, but even saying that is a little bit controversial, right? Because the nature of science is that it is ever changing. So, yeah, the science on vaccine safety is evolving. We're constantly collecting and evaluating new data, but the body of evidence where it points and the scientific consensus has not changed. What has changed is the policy environment, the information landscape, and the questions that people are bringing, that patients are bringing to the exam room and beyond. So I'll be pretty brief here. I think most folks are familiar with this, but I, for one, have had whiplash, with some of the changes that have been occurring in vaccine policy. So right before the holidays, there was the ACIP meeting where there were presentations by Tracy Beth Hogue and others on the vaccine schedules in other countries like Denmark. There were some proposed changes presented at that meeting. And then right before the holidays, on my son's birthday, actually, news broke about proposed schedule changes. And then right after the new year, January 5th, HHS released a memo that aligned the US schedule with other high income countries. A few weeks later, several large medical professional organizations reaffirmed the original schedule recommendations, and that has continued. But since then, there have been a lot of questions that have emerged from the public, but also from providers on, are there impacts on coverage and reimbursement for vaccines, access to vaccines? So we're going to get into some of those questions. So what changed? So yes, the federal vaccine schedule recommendations changed. We saw some vaccines shift to shared clinical decision making. A lot of the typical institutional review processes were bypassed. Public and provider confusion about what's recommended has certainly emerged. And like I said, there's been some insurance coverage uncertainty, in particular for some vaccines like the HPV vaccine, for example, where it's unclear whether will one dose be covered, will two doses be covered? And, there still remains some uncertainty there. What definitely did not change is the scientific consensus on safety and efficacy. Like I said, the recommendations from the AAP, ACOG, and others, vaccine availability, and this is very important to remind the public that all vaccines remain available and that there is guaranteed coverage through the end of 2026 for ACIP recommended vaccines. A reminder that the evidence base for vaccines is strong and that it has not changed. So we have decades of rigorous post-licensure surveillance data via VAERS, VSD, CISA, several other organizations. We have independent federal and global agencies that have reviewed and endorsed the US schedule. And based on a CDC estimate from 2024, we know that 500 million plus illnesses have been prevented by vaccines given to children born between 1994 to 2023. Now, I wanted to jump right in with something that I'm seeing a lot of, and I'm curious if you're seeing this as well. These calls for quote, new placebo-controlled trials of approved vaccines, right? Where are the double-blinded placebo-controlled studies for vaccines? Of course, and we'll talk more about this, but this ignores the fact that all vaccines, when they're first licensed, if there is no existing vaccine that treats that particular is licensed for a specific disease, must go through a randomized controlled trial, right? And that is compared to saline. However, when there becomes available a vaccine for a specific disease, it would become unethical to withhold that vaccine from people, and therefore we can no longer compare to a saline inert placebo. So the current review process is the gold standard of care. I wanted to jump in just to familiarize you with the way that we communicate via unbiased science. So this was an infographic that we put out in 2025. It was a cartoon that addressed this question. So should we test every new vaccine with a placebo? Now imagine this. We asked people to do a thought experiment here. And this is just a glimpse from that post. It's a much longer post. But would we test new seatbelts by leaving half the kids without one? Of course not. Once we know that something prevents serious harm, leaving people unprotected just to test it again is unethical. And that's why we don't use placebo trials when a vaccine for the disease already exists. What about the claim that we give too many too soon? So this is a very common refrain. Children receive too many vaccines. I'm sure you've all seen the photo of a young baby crying with 72 needles sticking out of their body. In these examples, they tend to focus on the doses given, not the protection against deadly diseases. Of course, they're inflating totals with things like flu vaccines and COVID vaccines that are given on an annual basis. They count combination vaccines as multiples, and they ignore how immune system capacity works. The reality, and I'll actually jump ahead here, is that modern vaccine technologies have allowed us to use fewer antigens and fewer vaccine doses over time. So here we use some data visualization to show that children in the US were previously exposed to over 3,000 antigens through routine vaccinations to prevent against 5 infectious diseases. And we're talking about the 1960s to 1970s. Think pertussis era. That's what the peak number of antigens that were included in vaccines. But today, we have a fraction of those antigens, under 200, and they protect against at least 14 infectious diseases. So for those who worry about there being too many antigens in vaccines, we also like to remind folks that our kids are exposed to far more antigens through the environment. So I think about when I send my kids to the playground, if they're playing in a sandbox, they are exposed to far more antigens than they are exposed to via vaccines. What about the other countries do less argument? So the HHS memo argued that the US schedule is out of step with peer nations. So the reality is that most peer nations, like the US, actually protect against 11 to 14 diseases by age 5. Yes, we're at the upper end, but we are certainly not an outlier. So Denmark is often cited as, doing less. The reality is that they're the true outlier, and they accept thousands of preventable hospitalizations annually from things that we do not. So things like rotavirus, varicella, and other unvaccinated diseases. Now, where schedules differ, this is often taken to mean that there's some sort of safety signal. But the reality is that this just reflects differences in our countries, in disease burden, in what diseases are endemic there versus here, in healthcare system infrastructure. And of course, we like to remind folks that a country like Denmark, with a population of around 6 million people, that represents the state of Wisconsin. Here in the US, we have over 340 million people. So a direct comparison requires context. Something that keeps coming up time and time again is the Hep B birth dose. So I think this is a great study. So we know that if an infant is infected with hepatitis B, 90% of them infected at birth will develop chronic Hep B infection. So why can Denmark skip the birth dose, but we can't? So Denmark screens nearly 100% of pregnant women for Hep B. They have a very centralized medical record system. They have far more reliable maternal infant follow-up, and they have universal health care, which ensures care continuity. Here in the US, unfortunately, about 1 in 8 pregnant women are never tested for Hep B. Even when we find a positive case, only about a third complete follow-up. We have fragmented records and inconsistent care. And so, yes, we do rely on a universal birth dose to protect, to be to help us when screening and follow-up fail. So a question for you all. So a parent arrives for her 12-month-old's well visit. Before you say anything, she says, I saw on the news that the government changed the vaccine schedule. So I guess we don't have to do all of them today, right? So what would you lead with? And I don't know if Maeve or if someone can just chime in. If folks can maybe respond in the chat with which letter corresponds to what you would lead with, maybe someone could just call out what we're seeing in terms of responses.
I'm seeing mostly B's right now. D, a lot of B's, and A, D,
Okay.
and B.
All right, we got a lot of star students here. So I think that the correct answer is B. And you'll see a theme, but the key, well, you'll see a theme in the presentation here is what I meant to say. But the key here is that first part, acknowledge what she's seen, right? And so you'll see that a lot of my communication style and what I have found to be effective is to start from a place of understanding, right? To build bridges, to acknowledge concern without dismissing it. So yes, I would acknowledge what she's seen. I would take a minute to distinguish policy from science and then share your recommendation clearly. Now, I say that because trust is a huge issue now more than ever. So, about 1 in 4 Americans believe that current vaccine recommendations were based on science and facts. Trust did not erode overnight. So when we talk, so we at InBioscience, we have a lot of conversations with folks who are vaccine hesitant, who are skeptics, folks who ultimately change their minds about vaccines. We've also consulted literature. So here we're referencing some data from KFF. But people will cite things like being dismissed, having their concerns dismissed, or over-promising. So people have heard vaccines are safe and effective, but they haven't heard the nuance. Why are we saying that? Why are we confident in saying that? And inadequate transparency on what we know versus what we don't know. And of course, the social media landscape amplifying doubt faster than science can respond. All of these things in combination with each other have really created fertile ground for misinformation to take hold. Another, another statistic that I find interesting, these are data from the Edelman Trust Barometer. These come from 2024. There's actually an update to this that showed much of the same trends here. So when polled and when asked, who do you trust to tell you the truth about new innovations and technology in health and science? People ranked scientists on par with someone like me or someone like them, right? So they're ranking their peers on par with scientists. So this tells me that, the old approach to public health, the very top-down, paternalistic, didactic approach that we've taken to science communication is not working anymore. People really want to feel let in on the process. They want to feel respected, and they do not want to feel spoken down to. So I argue that the information deficit model no longer works. This idea that people reject vaccines simply because they lack information is not supported by evidence. So I remind myself and I remind my team all the time that the mother who chooses not to vaccinate her child thinks she's making the right decision for her child. She's making that decision based on the information ecosystem that she's a part of, what her friends and family are saying, what her social media algorithm is serving up for her. So in reality, we see that more information can actually increase resistance in people who distrust the source. Fear appeals, so just screaming at people about how, if you don't get MMR, then your child will die from measles, things like that often backfire. They trigger a defensive response rather than behavioral change. Certainly condescension. If a person gets the sense that you're speaking down to them, that you're dismissing them, that is the single fastest way to lose a hesitant patient permanently. So what actually works? Connection, narrative, humor, visualization, and meeting people where they are. I won't spend too much time on this and just, in the interest of time here, but there's a trust gap. So, of course, there's the scientific reality, regulatory processes, scientific consensus, evidence-based decisions, risk assessment frameworks. And then on the other side of things, there's public perception. And these things are influenced by social media, by personal experience, by cultural beliefs and emotional responses. So there are gaps, right? And we have this major trust gaps. And then there are barriers that really exacerbate that gap. So when we use overly technical jargon or complex language, perceived conflicts of interest, historical mistrust, lack of transparency, and information overload. So what we have adapted at Unbiased is the listen first approach. So building trust through understanding. And I'm going to give you an applied example of this, but the framework goes from listening to understanding and connecting. So I don't know if you all remember, but about a year ago, a very prominent social media influencer made a big stink about food coloring in foods, Fruit Loops. There was a huge public outcry. It went viral. We were receiving thousands of messages from parents who said that they're, ditching cereals, they're emptying their cupboards, they're poisoning their children. And so I had a lot to say, but we waited. We waited. We monitored conversations. We looked at the comments. We looked at the questions. We were looking very carefully at what people's questions and concerns were. And what we found was that there were patterns, right? It wasn't just about the food coloring, the food dyes. It was about fear for their children's safety. It was distrust of big food. It was confusion about regulations and so on and so forth. Parents were not just asking about dyes, they were expressing deeper fears. So, what did we do? We didn't judge, we didn't shame, we built bridges. We acknowledged their concerns. So, a lot of our communication strategies led with, as a parent and a scientist, I understand the worry, but let's take a beat, let's take a breath, and let's look at what the research actually tells you. And I'll show you some of those examples just a bit later in the presentation. But it really boiled down to reminding folks that there were no human data that supported the claims that were being made. We don't have evidence that these things are causing cancer or the other outcomes that were being, that there was a lot of fear spread about. And that quelled a lot of the concerns. So there was this fantastic piece published in NPR in 2024 that I always cite, and it was called Connection Before Correction. So this means that you have to recognize that whoever it is you're speaking to, your friend, your family member, your patient, has a whole life's worth of experiences that affect how they engage with whatever they read online or hear on the news, right? And people tend to trust sources from their own cultural context. So just correcting misinformation actually fails short term. Instead, you want to start a dialogue, right? Ask about the evidence. So, what is the evidence is more effective than, nope, that's wrong, that's false. That shuts down the conversation where what is the evidence actually opens up a dialogue about trust, not just facts. So another survey I just wanted to call your attention to. This came from Healthline in 2024. Where did Americans learn about health tactics they've tried in the past year? Over half of Americans answered social media. So in my opinion, social media presents a real double-edged sword, right? We know that falsehoods and misinformation unfortunately run rampant, but it also means that we in the science, those of us who live in the space of health science and evidence, we have an opportunity to put out the really good information on social media. And I encourage everyone to do so. Now, something that I have completely fallen head over heels in love with is storytelling. And there's actually a lot of evidence in the literature that storytelling is extremely effective when it comes to communicating evidence and changing minds. So stories delay counter-arguing. So narrative communication creates openness to information by slowing that instinct to push back, right? Stories work where statistics fail. They connect to lived experience. They reach audiences that fact sheets and statistics never will. When people are absorbed in a story, they experience reduced counter-arguing and increased persuasion. And the more transported they are, the stronger the effect. And actually, we have found that this is especially effective for vaccines. Personal vaccine narratives, including hesitancy to acceptance stories, show measurable impact on knowledge, attitudes, and behavior. So I just wanted to share an example. So Like I said, this is something I love doing. I love using storytelling. So back in September, I wrote this piece. It was called A Public Health Scientist Walks into a Bar, Science, Skepticism, and Finding Common Ground. And in this piece, which I published on Substack and it later got picked up by Stat News, I shared my story and some photos. You'll see a photo of me and my mother. We're enjoying Brandy Alexander's, and that was the scene of the story where I interrupted four strangers to talk about mRNA. And so I won't get into too many of the details there, but it was a really cool piece because I detailed, this was my mother's last night in town. She was visiting from Florida. We decided to go to a dive bar. We drank Brandy Alexander's, which are important to us because that's a cocktail that my mother used to drink with her father. I shared those personal details. And then I talked about how there were four guys sitting at the table next to us, and I happened to overhear them talk about how COVID vaccines were rushed and mRNA was an experiment, and so on and so forth. And so a quote from the article, I said, as a Brooklyn Jew who talks with her hands, I physically sat on my hands to stay quiet. But guess what? It didn't work. So again, I go on to detail how these four men, they had varied levels of skepticism, and we shared beers and we talked for 15, 20 minutes about mRNA. And I came to learn that most of their skepticism came from incomplete information, not anti-science ideology. And so when I shared information with them about, oh, actually, no, mRNA technology is decades old, they were like, they paused. I really got through to them. And at the end of the conversation, three of them came up to me. They shook my hand. They shook my mother's hand. And at the end of the day, the fourth guy didn't. And so my takeaway was that, you know what? Some people can't be convinced. It doesn't happen instantly for everyone. But maybe, just maybe, I planted a seed. Maybe I made him think. And maybe he'll be less likely to share misinformation or falsehoods with his own network. Another thing that has lots of data to support its efficacy and something that we use all the time at Unbiased is humor. Humor lowers people's tendency to counter-argue. When people are entertained, their defenses come down. So we've also seen that using humor increases attention and retention. It reduces defensive processing. It is certainly more shareable when it comes to things like social media, right? People are much more likely to hit share, send it to their friends, post it to their page. But I will say something that I've learned doing this for the last 6 years on social media is that you have to use it strategically. First of all, not all things are appropriate, right, for humor. And also, if you're trying too hard or if you're inauthentic, that might not land with your audience. Humor that misses the mark could actually undermine credibility. So just wanted to flag that. It may not be appropriate in all cases at all times. So just to pull one applied example for you, and I'm sorry, I know there's a lot on the screen here, but another topic that's come up quite a bit in public health discourse over the last year or so is raw milk. And here, of course, we've seen that raw milk sales are spiking, they're surging despite warnings of risks associated with bird flu. And so what did we do? We started a campaign that used a little bit of humor. Don't raw dog it. We also did a campaign, utterly unpasteurized and utterly unsafe. So we used some puns. We did a whole campaign that had the tagline, "Nostalgia is not a public health strategy," where we leaned into this idea. Yeah, back in the day, people had raw milk before we had pasteurization, but guess what? They died of dysentery at 20 years of age, right? So we really leaned into that, the comedy, some clever phrasing, and people loved it. Another thing that I would encourage folks to lean into is data visualization and risk contextualization. So people are not bad at understanding risk. They're bad at understanding risk presented as abstract statistics. So sometimes, we'll share things like, oh, the risk of febrile seizure from the MMR vaccine is 0.003%. what does that mean to a person who doesn't really understand statistics, or what does that even mean? I'm trained in biostatistics, and I even struggle to understand what that means. So instead, you might reframe as something like about 3 in 100,000 children, or roughly one child in a stadium of 33,000 people may experience a brief fever-related seizure, all recovered without lasting harm. And actually, there's a lot of evidence that natural frequencies are understood 4 to 6 times more accurately than percentages. We know that visuals also reduce cognitive load. So when we do before and after comparisons, side-by-side risk comparisons, when we use people icons instead of pie charts, and when we use timeline graphics showing disease decline. So here are another couple of examples that we've used at Unbiased. On the left, you'll see again that this then versus now comparison. So showing, the number of people who had these diseases before vaccines and after vaccines. Then on the right-hand side, sorry, again, going back to the raw milk conversation, we use data visualization to show that unpasteurized milk is linked to 22 times more outbreaks than pasteurized milk, despite being consumed by a tiny percentage of the population. We've done this several other times. I just wanted to highlight a couple of campaigns I'm particularly proud of. I don't know if you remember, but back in 2024, there was a lot of fear around Cheerios and oatmeal. There was a study that went viral by the Environmental Working Group that got picked up by media, that there were these something called chlormequat, which is a plant growth regulator that was, all over oats and Cheerios, and that were poisoning our children. So what did we do? We took a beat and we looked at the toxicology data. We crunched some numbers, and we decided to present this as a data visualization to our audience. So how many Cheerios would you have to consume? You'd have to consume 1,647 boxes of Cheerios in a single sitting to reach that risk threshold, or 202 canisters of Quaker Oats to reach a risk threshold. And people love this. This really helps them put that risk into perspective. We're not eating this many things, so we probably don't need to be super concerned about these scary headlines. We've done this, of course, many times for vaccines. So we've done it in the context of formaldehyde, people being concerned about ingredients in vaccines. Excuse me. And so we let folks know, there's about 60 times more formaldehyde by weight in a pear than in any vaccine. We've done this for Girl Scout cookies. So we got a message from parents saying that their daughters were getting accosted outside of, Stop and Shop or ShopRite or whatever, saying that they're selling toxic, poisonous cookies. And so again, we looked at the data. We produced this visualization, which showed that a child would have to eat over 9,000 cookies daily to reach a potentially harmful dose of glyphosate. People appreciate context. So now, I attempted to sort of combine all of these techniques in that guest essay that I wrote for the New York Times back in August. And this is something that I'm super, super proud of. I'm going to show you some excerpts from the article in just a moment, but I try to blend together the storytelling, that idea of connection before correction, accessible analogies, data visualizations, risk contextualization, and strategic word choice to try to communicate about vaccines. So I'm happy to share a link to the actual article. I have to give total props to the New York Times team who really brought it to life. It's an interactive piece. And there on the right, you'll see a photo of me holding up the print version of the article, which was a highlight of my life. But The formula that I tried to convey in the article was sort of threefold. So first, I wanted to start with source credibility assessment. So let's talk about the folks who are likely going to be doing this research on vaccines and autism. Who are they? What are their financial motivations? Do they have conflicts of interest? Then I went into evidence landscape mapping. So, what is the research on vaccines and whether they cause autism? What's the quality of these studies and how can we distinguish good from bad? And then finally, what is an alternative explanation for rising autism diagnoses? So here again, here are some clips, and I'm happy to go into more detail if folks have questions. But if you can remember, so back when I wrote this, it was thought that this guy, David Geyer, was going to be the person tasked with leading this study that that HHS said that they were going to do to investigate whether vaccines cause autism. So that was my starting point. So David Geyer and his father, Mark, are infamous for deeply flawed studies. They created an illegitimate review board, which was composed of themselves and their friends and their business associates, that allowed them to promote a chemical castration drug, Lupron, as a quote unquote autism treatment for which they were charging people $5,000 to $6,000 a month. Now, David's father, Mark, had a medical license, which was revoked in all 12 states. David was fined for practicing without a license. And I would also remind folks that this is not a Geyer specific issue. So many of the others whose names keep coming up in the context of this vaccine autism research, we suspect will be involved in this in some way, have questionable backgrounds. But again, at the time, David was the person whose name kept coming up. So the next thing that we did was let's do a landscape analysis of the evidence. So here you can see studies examining the link between vaccines and autism. On the left, I don't know if you could see no, you can't. Can you see? I don't know if you could see my pointer, but on the left, you'll see studies that claim to have found a link. And then on the right, studies that did not find a link. When we took a closer look, we realized that a whopping 2/3 of the studies that claim to find a link were written by David and Mark Geyer. And these studies have been heavily criticized for using deceptive research techniques and flawed data. Among the 8 other studies, now here I'm on the right-hand side of the screen, that found a link, 4 were retracted for data manipulation, flawed methods, or undisclosed conflicts of interest. And most of the authors have been involved in anti-vaccination campaigns and or have had other papers retracted. So the scientific reality is that there have been about 70 studies that have examined vaccines and autism since 1998. 43 high-quality studies involving millions of people across countries have found no connection between vaccines and autism. And most recently, there was a great study that came out of Denmark that was very robust. It examined 50 different health outcomes, including autism, and found no association between vaccines, autism, ADHD, asthma, and other outcomes. The other thing that we did in this article was we talked about the playbook that is often used to promote this false idea that vaccines cause autism. So what are some red flags of poor study design? So the first thing that we focused on was something called p-hacking. So when people test multiple outcomes until they find one by chance. And in this case, we pulled a study that was done by the Geyers previously. They did exactly this, and they focused on atypical autism. And I'll talk about that in a second. Another red flag is mismatched comparison groups when you compare apples to oranges, when you ignore confounding variables and you don't account for things like healthcare access or socioeconomic status or parental age. Also self-citation loops. So when folks use only their own flawed studies as evidence, and misrepresenting sources. So we found at least one instance where they cited fish mercury studies to make claims about vaccine thimerosal, and ethyl and methyl mercury are two completely different things. So in the interest of time, I won't get into too much detail here, but the authors looked only at children with atypical autism. They did not provide any reason for why this narrow diagnosis would be focused on. And so to me, as a data scientist, this read very clearly as p-hacking. They likely tested multiple outcomes until they found one that showed a link by chance. The other issue was that the folks that they were comparing, so the people with the condition, the cases, versus the controls were very different, right? So usually you want them to come from the same time period. You want them to be as similar as possible so that you can meaningfully compare them. But in this study that the Geyers did, their groups were from wildly different time periods. So they were comparing apples to oranges. They compared children with high vaccination rates and a broad definition of autism to children with low vaccination rates and stricter autism criteria. So the result was manufactured from the beginning. They also completely ignored confounders. So like I said, we know that things like having healthcare access or a family history of autism can create the appearance of a connection. And interestingly, the Geyers dismissed this idea that controlling for confounders is important, and they claim that other studies supported this idea that you don't need to control for confounders. But when we took a look at those studies that they cited, you can look at that red box or the orange box in the top right corner. All of those studies that they cite were published by themselves. So again, this idea of circular citation. So why have autism diagnoses increased? So there was actually this great Swedish study that you could see the data here on the left-hand side of the screen. This was published in BMJ in 2015. And the Swedish study illuminated the difference between autism as a diagnosis and autism as a condition. And over time, they found that autistic traits were observed at a relatively stable rate, even as the rate of autism diagnosis more than doubled over a decade. So this signals to us that this is likely due to better awareness in screening, a broadening of diagnostic criteria, especially in 1994, there was a major diagnostic change, and also potentially some real genuine factors and demographic shifts, like people having babies at an older age, where we do see that older parental age may be associated with an increased likelihood of autism. So zooming out, the way I always like to let folks know, how they could maybe protect themselves against misinformation. What are some of the red flags of falsehoods? Number one is a reliance on a single study or a subset of studies that go against the overwhelming scientific consensus and body of evidence. Also, the use of preclinical or in vitro research to extrapolate to humans. So going back to that red dye example that I gave earlier when everyone was freaking out about Fruit Loops, a lot of the data, a lot of the data that was used to spread fear came from rat studies. So I like to tell people, unless you're a rat being submerged in a bucket of red dye, you probably don't need to be worried, because we don't see those effects when we conduct clinical trials, when we look at the data in humans. When we talk about risk, it's a huge red flag when the dose is not specified. Of course, we know that the dose makes the poison. Improper study design. This may not be easy for folks who don't have a background in data science, but a good rule of thumb is to just take a look at the groups being compared and make sure that it's an apples to apples comparison. Proper controls for confounders, and also reminding people that so sorry, not all studies are created equal, and every study has its limitations. So an experimental study versus an observational study. And of course, there are ethical considerations. We can't always compare to an inert saline placebo, for example. And so sometimes there are limitations that drive the types of studies that we're able to conduct. I'm going to take just 1 sec to take a sip of water if it's okay. Give me 1 second. Okay. So just to reiterate the framework and practice, listen first, validate the concern, find shared values, find some common ground, right? We all want the same thing, a healthy child. Start there. Then share the evidence, and when possible, end with agency. So I'm here to help you make the best decision for your family. So you're not telling them, you're helping them make an informed decision for themselves and their family. Agency is extremely important. All right, another question for you. So a father of a 2-month-old says very calmly, I've done a lot of research and I just don't think all these vaccines are necessary for a healthy kid. Can we just skip most of them? So if you could respond in the chat with which response option you would select, and then Maeve, if you could just let me know.
I'm seeing mostly B's again.
We got the A team here with us today, star students. So yes, again, start from a place of questioning, right? So ask him, what is it that he's most concerned about? Acknowledge he clearly cares deeply about his child's health. You do as well. That's always good to remind them. And then find out, what does a lot of research look like for him? And then you can engage in that conversation where you're sharing the best available evidence. Now, I want to leave time for Q&A, so I'm going to go a little bit quickly through these slides, but just zooming out and speaking a bit more generally on what I have found, in science communication more generally, is that there are gaps in science literacy that share themes. So there's lack of fundamental science knowledge, there's vulnerability to logical fallacies, we see overconfidence in scientific knowledge, and a lack of understanding of research and implications for validity and reliability. And I say this because rather than debunking every single myth or falsehood that crops up, we like to weave in lessons to help people build a foundation, to give them foundational knowledge so that when they see future falsehoods, they might be less likely to believe them or share them. And so we often call this pre-bunking. So I would argue that a combination of debunking and pre-bunking is a recipe for success. So some examples, and not all of these are relevant to vaccines, but we often hear things like, sugar composition or, natural things like honey or maple syrup are better than table sugar or high fructose corn syrup, when in reality, they all have nearly identical sugar compositions. There's also this idea in general that anything natural is better or safer than things that are artificial. And so we give examples like take butter flavor, right? Natural and artificial flavor chemicals are actually the exact same molecules, chemically speaking. They're just named such to reflect the raw materials that were sourced to make them. Now, here's where we get into a lot of that foundational education that I think is really critical, especially when it comes to vaccines. So I'll actually start on the left. So in vitro and in vivo studies, right? So the difference between studies that are conducted in rats or in petri dishes and in labs, these are fundamentally different than studies that are conducted in humans. Both are critical. Both are very important steps in things like, vaccine development. But we cannot assume that what happens in a rat or in a lab is automatically going to translate to humans. Here on the right is one of the slides I'm quite proud of, which helps address this idea of correlation versus causation, right? Ice cream causes shark attacks, and if you eat ice cream, you will be killed by a shark. Of course, we know that that's not the case, and it just so happens that in the summer months, people are much more likely to purchase ice cream during those hot summer days. And they're also more likely to swim in the ocean where they're more likely to be attacked by a shark. So helping people understand that just because two things occur at the same time does not mean that one caused the other. There's also something that's important to call out, which is the risk perception gap. excuse me, the public is often more afraid of certain risks than evidence warrants. So they'll focus on things like individual food ingredients and additives, or individual chemicals or vaccine side effects, and not on things like overall dietary patterns and preventative health and sleep quality and so on and so forth. Now, one other thing I do want to take a second to call out is, in the past, I have told people, your anecdote is not evidence. And I'm a little bit embarrassed by that, because that really dismisses their lived experience. So I've recently reframed this into something that I think is a lot more powerful, which is, anecdotes are data points, right? They're important, but they're not evidence in and of themselves. So I give the example of my friend who tried the keto diet. He said it totally changed his life. Everyone should do the keto diet. And I started asking him some questions. I said, "Oh, interesting. Did you happen to make any other lifestyle changes?" He reflected, "Oh, yeah, I cut alcohol out of my diet. I started walking, in the mornings and the evenings." And my point is that what studies do is they help control for those other variables, for those other confounders that are likely impacting outcomes. And we can't do that on an individual basis, right? Because we know that anecdotes are prone to bias. I'll skip past this, but people often get confused about what's happening here in the US versus other countries. Here in the US, we tend to take a risk-based approach versus a hazard-based approach, which is popular in the UK and in Europe, where we take into account likelihood of causing harm. And so sometimes, though, people will see this and they perceive this to mean that things in the US are less safe, which is not inherently true. A couple of final thoughts here. Choose your words carefully. So I had the great honor and privilege of having Dr. Paul Offit join us on the podcast, and we were talking about the term natural immunity, and we were joking about how that is so much sexier to people than vaccine-induced immunity. It's natural, right? It doesn't seem all that bad. It's natural. How could it be bad? In reality, we might want to think about using the term survivor immunity, which helps people understand that you only get that immunity when you survive the illness. And that's the whole point. The vaccines are being used to try to avoid all of the risks that come with natural infection. Again, in the interest of time, I'll go pretty quickly over this, but rather than saying something, if your patient comes in and says, "Oh, I've heard vaccines cause autism," instead of saying, "No, the study was retracted, vaccines don't cause autism," you might want to instead say, that's common. I've heard that a lot. Can I share what the research actually shows? If you have a patient who comes in who says, "My child doesn't need Hep B, we're not at risk," avoid saying, "All babies need it. That's the recommendation." Instead, say, "I understand why you might think this. Hep B is mostly known as an adult disease. However," and then you can share the reason why we tend to give it at birth. I think I'm going to pass through these things quickly, but basically, there is a lot going on. And of course, people are seeing all the policy changes. I think it's important to acknowledge what they've seen, but distinguish policy from science, lead with your recommendation as an expert, but don't, but of course, don't be condescending in that process. And one thing that clinicians have flagged for me that I just wanted to mention, because I understand we do have a lot of clinicians in the audience, is that it's also helpful now, since several vaccines have shifted to shared clinical decision making, to really familiarize yourselves with EHR prompts, as some vaccines may no longer auto-populate. Now, actually, I already talked about this, but basically helping people understand that, no, you're right. The science is never settled. That's the beauty of science, right? We're always collecting new information. But the two phrases, "the science is never settled" and "trust the science," are compatible, because we can follow the best evidence we have today and still be willing to update if the evidence changes. This is a strength, not a weakness of the scientific process. Finally, navigating Vaccines in this fragmented information landscape, there are some incredible trusted sources. The AAP has remained incredible. CHOP Vaccine Education Center, CIDRAP at the University of Minnesota, the CDC's Pink Book. And then if I can give a little shameless plug for Unbiased Science, as well as the Evidence Collective, we always cite all of our sources and do our best to share the best available evidence. So what I hope you take away today is, no, the scientific consensus has not changed. Unfortunately, standard review processes were bypassed. Major medical organizations still recommend the original schedule. You have the tools to have these conversations, and you should lean into things like storytelling, humor, and data visualization. These are not soft skills. And I'll just end here with a big thank you to folks, and I hope we can leave 5 minutes for Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Steyer, for that incredible presentation. We have a number of thoughtful questions coming in. The first one, someone asked, I think you were talking about randomized controlled trials for vaccines, which was very interesting. And someone asked, would it still be unethical if non-vaxxers volunteered to be a part of the study as the one who does not get the vaccine? I'm sure it would, but just thinking out loud. So curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, as someone who's gone through the IRB process, human protections are extremely rigorous. And even if people are willing, it could be argued that they have incomplete information or misinformation. And because we have knowledge of the benefit of vaccines, it would still be deemed unethical to withhold those vaccines. So the answer is yes.
Great answer. Makes sense. This one I thought was interesting. Is there data on which healthcare providers patients trust the most? I believe I've seen some KFF polls out there, but when it comes specifically to vaccine recommendations, so nurses versus doctors, pharmacists, things like that.
Yeah. So first, I'd say pediatricians, just in terms of clinician specialty, that always jumps out as a one of the most trusted specialties of medicine. I always call pediatricians the Mr. Rogers of of medicine. I think they're incredible. And yeah, nurses, PAs, folks who have a lot of that, patient encounter time, a lot of contact with patients, they're very trusted. They tend to have maybe more of a connection with the patient, more time with the patient. So they have a great opportunity, a real opportunity there to share vaccine information with patients.
Yes, I'll take the Dr. Or Mr. Rogers reference. It's wonderful. Yeah, I think I've seen two charts that compare to like trusting government agencies or even public health or even RFK Jr. himself. And you're correct, like doctors, nurses, things like that always rank much higher. So, all right, these get a little more specific. I'm trying to stay aware of the time. Someone asked, sometimes in the course of conversation, we're able to identify some cognitive dissonance or logical fallacy in how a perspective slash position has been constructed. Is it helpful to point those out directly?
It's a good question. I'd say you got to know your customer, right? There are some people who will be more receptive to it. Actually, we find that a lot of folks in our audience appreciate it when we do it. They say, wow, I've never thought of it that way. But then, yes, you'll have people who feel judged and they'll shut down. And I will also say, as a non-clinician, I'm doing this behind a keyboard, behind a screen, whereas many folk, you as clinicians are doing it one-on-one. So it is possible, I would imagine, that the dynamic might change. But if presented gently and with a person who seems receptive, I think it could actually be really valuable.
That's great. Okay, maybe just one more to end here. Do you recommend a specific quick talking point slash scientific evidence to reassure parents who are concerned about vaccines causing autism?
Is my New York Times piece an okay answer? No.
Sure. Yeah.
I'm sorry. No. That was such a shameless plug and honestly a bit of a joke.
I thought I translated science into lay, word. I mean, I think it's fine, but yes.
But I think that the CHOP Vaccine Education Center has done an incredible job as well, really walking through the history of it. I don't think folks realize, this all started with Andrew Wakefield and that he was getting paid to create a study. He was creating also a competitor vaccine. People don't understand some of the fundamentals of how this seed even got planted, and CHOP in particular has done a really great job of, telling the story of that history.
Agreed. Well, it is right at 1 o'clock, so we'll be respectful of everyone's time. Thank you again for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you again at our next series webinar. Have a great day, everyone.